On episode 13 of the Platform to Perform podcast, I'm going to be talking about everything to do with training the trunk. The powers of social media mean every man and their dog has an opinion on how best to train the muscles of the core, or what will be defined in the rest of this episode as the trunk. Rather than talk about aesthetics, because let's face it, young kids have enough of that to deal with, this podcast will focus on the role of trunk training in terms of athletic performance. Before we dive into the nuts and bolts, let's start with a definition of what the trunk is and what its function is. For me, everything between your knees and your neck is the trunk. And the role of the trunk is to help create motion, resist unwanted motion, and ultimately transfer force between the upper and lower extremities. The trunk should be able to perform all of these actions in all three planes of movement, more on this later, and it should be able to respond to both high and low load stability challenges with the appropriate amount of effort. The reason why I feel definitions are important when it comes to training is because how we define a certain training concept will ultimately dictate the exercises we select and the methods we utilize to train the trunk. So based on this definition I've just given, our trunk training for athletes should involve up and down movement, side to side movement, and rotational movement. This is covering our movement in all three planes. Our trunk training should help us create and resist forward and backward bending, sidewards bending, and rotation. The muscles of the trunk are designed more to help us resist movement than to create it. Our trunk training should also involve transferring force from the lower extremities to the upper extremities and help us prepare to deal with both high load and low load stability challenges in an appropriate manner. Based on this definition, you should also see how a trunk training program that consists of endless crunches and planks will not cut the mustard with athletes. This isn't to say planks aren't useful, but I'll get into this in a little while as to where they fit in the grand scheme of things. Crunches are simply an up and down movement, so this fails to tick the box of working all three planes. This is not to say that every single exercise should work all three planes simultaneously, but with some researchers reporting that crunches may result in unwanted and unnecessary stress to the lumbar spine. This is any of McGill's work, which I'll place in the show notes. You can soon see why crunches don't cut the mustard when athletes are concerned. Planks involve no movement, so whilst this ticks the box of resisting unwanted movement, in specifically extension of the spine, planks don't tick the box for helping us create movement. Now, the reason why there is no best exercise for the trunk, despite what the powers that be on Instagram might tell you, not every movement of the trunk, or not every exercise, should tick every box. However, if we're not ticking all of these boxes, we're leaving some untapped performance on the table. If we take a whistle-stop tour of the anatomy of the trunk, we'll soon see that there's no such thing as a best exercise to train the trunk, and this is in part because we have certain muscles of our trunk that are designed for specific roles within our body. The trunk can be subdivided into smaller sections, which, if well trained, can provide the appropriate level of stability at the appropriate time. These smaller sections can be broken down as the local stabilizers. These are the core muscles that are closest to our body. They tend to be smaller, and as such, they're best suited to responding to low load stability challenges, such as subtle changes in our posture. The global stabilizers, these are the larger muscles of the trunk. These are better suited to helping us resist unwanted motion. You can think of these as the body's brakes. Finally, we have the global movers. Since these muscles attach furthest away from the spine and are larger, these muscles are suited best to creating motion. In terms of responding to the appropriate strategy, you can soon see how relying solely on the smaller muscles of the local stabilizers might not be ideal if our foot is hitting the floor with 10 times body weight going through us when we sprint. On the flip side of that, if we're recruiting large muscles of the trunk simply by bending over to tie our shoelaces, we're expending unnecessary energy and tiring ourselves out at an incredibly inefficient rate. So now we've established how certain sections of the trunk are suited for specific purposes, let's talk about categorizing our trunk training. For me, trunk training can be divided into three portions. The first being trunk stability exercises. For me, these are classified as exercises with little to no motion occurring in the spine or the pelvis. Typically, these exercises are performed for longer durations to ensure the slow twitch fibers have a chance to be recruited, and as such, they could interchangeably be termed local muscular endurance or trunk capacity exercises. Typically, a lot of what I see on Instagram is trunk capacity or trunk stability. These exercises include, but are not limited to, dead bugs, plank variations, Superman and bird dog type exercises, or any type of static holds. For example, an isometric glute bridge. Trunk strength, which for me would be the second part of the trunk pyramid, or I would also refer to this as high load stability. These are exercises where the athlete attempts to resist excessive unwanted motion of the spine and pelvis through a larger range of motion. So for example, you're trying to resist excessive rotation, sidewards bending, or spinal bending. So something like a deadlift would be high load trunk stability, as well as being a hip hinge pattern. Typically, these exercises should involve longer levers and or the addition of external load. Trunk strength exercises for me would include, but are not limited to, anti-rotation presses, also referred to Pallof presses, loaded carries, so farmer's walks, suitcase carries, overhead carries, and any of the other loaded carry family. Longer lever trunk exercises, so these are stuff like hanging leg raises or barbell rollouts. Finally, in our trunk training paradigm, trunk power exercises. Typically, people jump to trunk power exercises before they've learned to resist movement. This is a mistake because you cannot fire a cannon out of a canoe. You need to build that stability before you worry about layering on strength and power. Trunk power exercises are those that look to increase our rate of force production of the core musculature. These exercises should be performed explosively and include some form of force transfer and ultimately include a release phase. Think about any medicine ball throw variations. They're teaching us and our athletes to link the lower body to the upper body and involve continuous acceleration. In the following parts of the podcast, I'm going to explain these concepts in greater detail. I'm also going to discuss how to assess where your athletes are in terms of their trunk training, how these types of trunk training might relate to sport, some practical tips for embedding trunk training into your program, and an example trunk training program, which I'm happy to email anyone who requests it. So far we've defined the trunk, we've explored the anatomy, and we've used this to help lay out parameters for optimizing our trunk training for the youth athlete. Now we're going to go on to understanding how to determine whether your athlete may benefit more from low load stability or high load stability exercises. I want to provide an assessment of how you can feel confident with a means of assessing low load stability and understanding why functional and non-functional low load stability exercises can benefit an athlete. Kicking things off with a definition, low load stability or local muscular endurance can provide the platform for greater developments in trunk strength and power. These exercises are designed to develop the ability to maintain a neutral spine while enduring forces from movement through a specific plane of motion. Low load stability can be classified as functional or non-functional. The word functional has become bastardized beyond belief in the realm of strength and conditioning. So for clarity's sake, these are how I would define non-functional and functional low load stability. And before I get into that, it's not to say that one is better than the other. It just depends on the context. So functional low load stability for me is any exercise that enables the athlete to manipulate their body in all planes of motion. Non-functional would be performed across a single plane of motion. Functional exercise for a low load stability context would be performed in weight bearing. So this could be standing, single-legged, standing, squatting, or lunging. Whereas non-functional, we're looking at partial weight bearing positions. So this is stuff like sitting, kneeling, lying face up or face down. For the functional exercise, as I've said, you're involving multiple planes of motion with multiple joint positions, whereas non-functional, we may be looking at movement that's isolated to fewer joints. Example exercises of functional low load stability would include, but not limited to, something like a single arm dumbbell RDL, a step up with the weight in one arm, or an offset dumbbell lunge. You can see how these movements might be classified as functional because stuff like hinge patterns, lunge patterns, are stuff we see in both everyday life and in sport. To follow up though, non-functional core low load stability exercises by the definition I've given would include stuff like a Swiss ball plank, a side plank, and a hollow body hold. Now, on the subject of static exercises, the reason why I would use a static exercise is simply to teach youth athletes the idea of how to create tension. For me, if a youth athlete cannot hold a strict hollow body position, if you're not sure what that is, think of an extended dish position, and it's the position you would want your athletes to be in when they attempt to do a pull-up. Now, a phrase I like to use with my athletes is that tighter is lighter. If you can't create tightness or tension within your body, you're going to have a hard time moving it dynamically when it comes to stuff like press-ups and pull-ups. The focus here is on timing, coordination, and effective spinal control during all movements. Unlike trunk strength exercises, which involve greater muscular effort, excessive tension in low load stability exercises is unproductive and actually represents an energy leak. If you're recruiting every possible muscle of your trunk simply to try and tie your shoelaces, you'll burn out pretty quickly. So now we know what we're aiming for in terms of our low load stability exercises. How do we determine whether or not an athlete might need them? Here's some key questions I would ask. Does the athlete possess the body awareness to hold a neutral spine? If they don't, I would forget everything else until they can. Without the ability to hold a neutral spine, adding load or speed to any type of exercise, whether it's for the core or the prime movers, is only going to result in an increased injury risk. Secondly, I would ask, does the athlete play a sport that lasts longer than 60 seconds? If so, longer duration assessments might be considered an appropriate and reasonable test of the type 1 slow twitch fibers in the core musculature. On a side note, even if an athlete is involved in a sport that is over in seconds, so for example, a sprinter, a shot putter, a weightlifter, if they crumble like a dunked rich tea biscuit after a trunk assessment of more than a few seconds, this glaring weakness may manifest itself in performance or increase injury risk. Low load stability forms the platform for trunk strength and endurance. Think about it. If your body cannot respond to low load challenge of stability, such as changes in posture, how do you expect to be able to handle the high loads and forces associated with sport or the weight room? Low load stability assessments should look to evaluate posture, stability, movement quality, endurance, and dissociation. Dissociation is a fancy way of describing the body's ability to create motion in certain parts of the body while resisting movement in the other parts of the body. Examples of this could be in the sagittal plane. So for example, can the athlete maintain a neutral spine while moving their hips up and down in a squat pattern, or moving their hips backward and forwards in a hip hinge pattern? We can also look at the frontal plane. So this is looking at side-to-side movements. So for example, can the athlete keep their knees in line with their toes during a single leg stepping exercise, especially if you've offset their balance by adding a weight in one hand? From a transverse plane or a rotational perspective, can the athlete maintain balance over their base of support while throwing and catching a medicine ball stood on one leg? These are simple things we can look to evaluate both in our warm-ups and especially with youth athletes. We don't have to dedicate an entire assessment session to get a feel for how our athletes are performing these. As I've said, typically the trunk acts to stabilize the spine in the presence of movement. Since the kinesthetic feedback of the lower back against the ground allows athletes to self-coach, I really like the dead bug as a very simple assessment tool in terms of teaching athletes to maintain a neutral spine. You'd be surprised how many athletes can butcher something as simple as a dead bug, both from a coordination perspective, hip tightness perspective, which you might see with the knee pulling forward, or simply seeing how their upper body mobility is in terms of the arms going overhead. In my personal experience, it works wonders for creating buy-in from youth athletes. When they can't perform a relatively simple task, all of a sudden they want to know why they can't keep their back flat. Typically, it's a hip mobility or a core stability issue, but they're bought in because all of a sudden they're shown something simple and they get frustrated because they can't do it. It's also worth noting that low load stability and high load stability trunk exercises are separate entities in the continuum. Now, I know I've said previously that the low load stability can build the endurance that might be necessary for the high load stuff. You might get a powerlifter, I mean, I'm a prime example in this, who can demonstrate impressive levels of high load stability by not folding under heavy loads, but they don't have the requisite endurance to maintain effective posture throughout longer duration efforts. In working at an all-girls school, on the odd occasions where they've demanded more core stuff and I've joined them for something like a 10-minute ab thing just to finish off with a bit of fun, it's very soon on show that I do not practice longer endurance postural holds. Again, looking back to the sport specificity side of things, the trunk capacity required to hold a certain posture on a bike for a triathlon or an Ironman event over a longer time frame is a different quality to picking up, say, over double body weight for a couple of seconds in a powerlifting meet. Also interesting to note is as youth athletes encounter growth spurts, they might find that previously owned stability they once had has been lessened somewhat. I've coached a particular female athlete who could hip thrust double body weight, no problem, but struggled with the precision and control required for low-level stability exercises, which her physio attributed to the back issues she was struggling with. It's no good having all the horsepower in the world without having the ability to coordinate finer movements. I would liken this to this athlete who demonstrated impressive levels of high load stability on a hip thrust, but couldn't coordinate the finer movements involved in something as simple as a dead bug heel tap. Although relating trunk work to the demands of the sport can be useful, the reality is youth athletes need both the ability to respond to small changes in posture, so what's their body awareness like, as well as the ability to create appropriate tension when the task demands it. So you've got to think of low load stability exercises. Yes, they form the basis for strength and power development, but just because you demonstrate high level of ability in one does not guarantee it in the other. Low load trunk exercises should focus on precision, timing, and control rather than excessive muscular effort. You should not be bracing whilst performing something like a dead bug. And just because a trunk exercise is non-functional, so for example, we're in a static posture, this doesn't mean it doesn't transfer. A combination of functional and non-functional low-load stability exercises are going to be needed at different times of a youth athlete's career. Whilst low-load stability exercises are designed to improve the capacity of a specific area to tolerate repetitive loading, once a high load of capacity has been developed in all planes, we can begin to look at exercises that improve the strength of the core musculature. This is finally where we start to teach our youth athletes how to brace to maintain their posture against heavier loads. The highest loads will always be lifted in up and down movements. There's a reason why no one's lateral raising a weight that they can squat or deadlift. However, there's still means of assessing and introducing trunk control into multi-planar high load situations, examples of which include offset step-ups or offset lunges, heavy suitcase or waiter walk carries. And in terms of the transverse plane, can the athlete maintain their balance over the base of support whilst performing multi-directional hop and holds? Remember, load doesn't have to come in the form of more weight. Speed itself will increase the amount of force the body has to stabilize against. It's much harder to put the brakes on when sprinting versus stopping after a gentle jog. Now, although squats and deadlifts can go a long way in developing the high load trunk stability in our athletes, it's a mistake to assume they take care of everything. A study by Apes and Swinton in 2014 reported greater abdominal activation with overhead squats compared to regular back squats. Now, considering overhead squats will always involve a lighter weight than back squats, this also demonstrates the potential for longer lever work, stuff like ab wheel rollouts, hanging leg raises, and long lever planks when it comes to developing trunk strength. Another reason why we need more than just squats and deadlifts is because athletes have the ability to resist unwanted movement in 3 dimensions. This means our trunk training has to also involve exercises that resist flexion, lateral flexion, and rotation. Again, this is stuff where we're looking at pal-off press variations, suitcase carries, and anti-rotation presses. Final stage in our trunk training paradigm is trunk power training. These exercises are designed to improve the rate of force production by the core musculature. These exercises prepare an athlete to stabilize and to generate force dynamically at more sport-specific speeds. It's imperative your athlete has the appropriate trunk stability and lumbopelvic stability prior to progressing onto these advanced trunk power exercises. If athletes haven't developed the ability to stabilize their trunk in all 3 planes at a slow, or in the case of static positions, no speed, then coaches should tread carefully with more complex medicine ball variations. I'd advise anyone to check out the work of Eamon Flanagan when it comes to categorizing medicine ball throw variations, because you can have either extensive, intensive, or complex elastic type throws. Extensive throws are where you're going to look at a higher volume and perhaps lower speeds. Intensive, we're looking for fastest throws that are more taxing on the nervous system, and complex elastics are where we're looking at some form of stretch shortening cycle, possibly combining this with some form of acceleration. So coaches can gradually introduce multiplanar medicine ball throws by starting towards the extensive end of the spectrum and gradually building through this. With youth athletes who may lack the necessary stability to take advantage of the more explosive medicine ball trunk exercises, building them from the ground up, so progressing from seating to kneeling to standing, can be a logical way to begin. The amount of medicine ball variations can be exhausting and probably warrants a post in itself. So for simplicity's sake, let's start with exercises that progressively challenge dynamic stability, that allow the athlete to be explosive, and ideally include an element of rotation if we're working with a multi-directional athlete, which is pretty much anyone apart from a powerlifter or weightlifter. I'm not a fan of variation for variation's sake, nor am I suggesting that you don't coach the athlete in front of you. However, simply exposing youth athletes to medicine ball throws can work wonders for teaching weight transfer. And in the final part of the trunk series podcast, I want to talk about how we fit all these adaptations together. With the various trunk training adaptations, it's easy to be fooled into thinking you have to dedicate an entire training session just to trunk exercises. The reason why this isn't the case is because oftentimes these adaptations are covered elsewhere in a decent strength and conditioning program. Prime examples are for athletes who are competently performing squats and deadlifts. We're developing that high load stability or that trunk strength simply by having them maintain posture under load. Athletes who are performing multi-planar, plyometric or jumping and landing exercises in different directions, having to stabilize with side-to-side movement and rotational movements. And athletes who perform unilateral or asymmetrical step-ups and farmer's walks will already be having to use their glute med and their QL muscles to stabilize in the frontal plane. And they're trying to prevent excessive sideways bending and their knees caving in whilst trying to counteract heavy loads, which are offsetting them. Now, if you would like an example of a trunk training progressions or program that I've put together, feel free to email me at todd.davidson2011@gmail.com. Again, whilst the template I would provide is not a bad template to follow, it's overly simplistic to just think you can train a block of trunk stability, then move on to trunk strength, and then conclude with trunk power. Youth athletes can lose previously developed trunk stability, as I mentioned, when they hit growth spur. So they've previously nailed on technique, such as basic squatting, hip bending patterns. These can be thrown out the window. In summary, the ability to create movement or possessing the range of motion and resist it can and should be trained alongside the ability to create and produce force rapidly. There's no point having an athlete who can plank for days, but then can't transfer force between the upper and lower extremities. Since the trunk is involved in pretty much every sporting activity, it can be helpful to develop a trunk that can produce force on demand and in more specific movement patterns. When it comes to youth athletes, one of my favorite drills, stolen from Shane Fitzgibbon, is to have athletes do wheelbarrow variations. So where one athlete is holding the other athlete's legs in a press-up position and then reactive leg drops. This will show if the athlete can reactively stiffen up their core in order to prevent themselves collapsing in a crumbled heap on the floor. And this is pretty much what sport is going to test us. And if we've built appropriate building blocks of stability and strength, then it should be very easy to spot athletes who can reflexively stiffen their trunk in sport-specific movement patterns. Ultimately, sports performance is the name of the game, and this is where we eventually want to see our trunk training manifest itself. As ever though, context is king. Just because an exercise looks more specific doesn't necessarily mean it's the best choice for that athlete at that time. Any gains in sports-specific trunk training need to be built on a general foundation of creating and resisting movement. That said, my favorite variations of more sports-specific trunk training can be found if you look up Lee Taft's variations. So stuff like banded shuffles or hip turns with medicine balls or even wall drives. So now we're training the trunk to be reactive in sports-specific movements, both with acceleration, side shuffling, and changing of direction. My practical recommendations to sum up this podcast are that you should include exercises that challenge your athlete's ability to resist and create extension, flexion, rotation, and lateral flexion. So you're resisting the spine bending in both ways. You're resisting the body twisting excessively and resisting the body's bending sideways. You compare an exercise where the athlete resists a given movement with one where they have to create it. So this can also work post-activation potentiation, in my opinion. I haven't seen any literature on it, but I believe that pairing heavy anti-rotation presses with a medicine ball rotational throws are good ways of working both ends of the spectrum, including loaded carry variations. So single arm overhead variations can be used to challenge low load stability, whereas heavy farmer's walk can challenge high load trunk stability. Choose accordingly. One of my favorite variations with youth athletes is wheelbarrow variations, whereby, for example, you might have the athlete A using their right hand to hold athlete B's left leg, and both of them walk. So you've got one walking in the form of a wheelbarrow. The person who is in the wheelbarrow is resisting rotation and lateral flexion. The person holding, because they're doing the holding on one side, is also doing the same. Grouping low load stability exercises together can challenge the trunk musculature from an endurance perspective. So this is where we might look at core capacity or trunk capacity circuits. Female athletes, I found this is a very quick win into their buy-in because they're probably going to do, in my experience, do a load of this stuff anyway. And finally, sport-specific trunk work and medicine ball throws can be used to improve the trunk musculature in explosive actions. I hope that you've found this this podcast informative. I'll include a list of all the resources where I've drawn this information from in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you again in the next episode.